We wanted to first share just a little bit of background about the Ready for 100 campaign. Some of you all have been with us since 2018, 2017, when we were first getting this conversation rolling in Chicago. And so much has happened since then. Ultimately, we are building the momentum, right? This is a conversation that is not just about 100% clean energy. This is a conversation that builds on the work and the demands of communities across Chicago that are asking for racial equity and economic justice as well. In 2019 of last year, we actually passed a resolution within City Council by a unanimous vote to set a goal of 100% clean energy. But there were a few things in that resolution that we wanted to raise with you today. Next slide. Namely, from this resolution, we wanted to pull out this one piece that ultimately we want this transition and the plan that charts the course for this transition to be determined by principles of justice and equity. So through community engagement, through events like this, and hopefully plenty of others that really meet community groups where they are, we want community members to determine the principles of a just transition, identify key equity metrics, and develop a meaningful feedback process for this transition. So the resolution calls for three things, and the first is to actually make a plan about how we're going to get to 100% clean energy. And we know that that can either be done behind closed doors with a small portion of people or a number of stakeholders, but more than anything, we want to ensure that that's something that's done with community voices, and particularly with communities that have borne the burden of utility burden, high energy prices, or who haven't necessarily had the same access to clean energy technology. Today, we're going to be talking about long-term jobs specifically, and how we can ensure that that is a critical part of the conversation. Next slide. All right, so in this year, 2020, so much has taken us for a loop, and particularly around jobs and economic recovery, right? That's the conversation of this fall. As we're in the budget season for Chicago, and as cities across the country are trying to figure out what programs stay, what programs go, and where to reinvest dollars, it's important to us that we see this clean energy transition as more than just carbon emission reductions, but also as a way to stimulate the economy and get people back to work. So imagine this, and look over here at the left side. Imagine as we try to reconstruct and redevelop our energy systems, yes, it will take dollars, but you can also really put a lot of people back to work. We're talking about existing housing and building stock. We're talking about new construction, and there are major development conversations taking place in the city, like Invest Southwest, that we think should be sure to incorporate things like energy efficiency, weatherization, and actual clean energy technology. Next slide. Here's just a little bit of background, and we'll be sure to share this with you later too in another format. But we know that this is not a new conversation, and we're building not only upon that community energy, but also there is some legislation already in place to get us there. This is not just a conversation in Chicago, but we're going to need to make some movement at the state level too. So some of you may be familiar with the Future Energy Jobs Act that was passed in 2016, and we are already training different residents in Chicago to be a part of the clean energy economy. And then that a proposed act and a new bill is the Clean Energy Jobs Act, not the Chicago Energy Jobs Act, but the Clean Energy Jobs Act will expand upon some of those programs and launch new funds to support contractors and workforce development hubs. That's just in part what CEJA can do. And we need things like this type of legislation at the state level to really allow us to make that space for Chicagoans. All right, let's move on. Next slide, please, Kassie. Okay. All right, great. So we are now gratefully joined by two fantastic speakers here in Chicago. The first being Ms. Cheryl Johnson, who is the Director of People for Community Recovery. I will not take up too much airtime thinking about that group agreement from earlier. I will let Cheryl tell her story in the work of PCR as well. And we also are joined by Kassie Beyer from Jobs to Move America. And so they're each going to give us about, maybe like a 5-minute recap of the work and highlights of your work that is taking place this year and how it relates to the clean energy economy. All right, so let's go back to Cheryl's slide and I'll turn it over to you, Cheryl. All right, let's see. Cheryl, are you still with us?
Yeah, I was muted. I was talking my butt off too. Pardon me, everybody. My name is Cheryl Johnson, and I'm the Executive Director of People for Community Recovery. I'm also a resident of Allgale Gardens, a public housing development on the far south side of Chicago. People for Community Recovery, our acronym is PCR. We are community-based environmental justice organizations that has been doing environmental work for over 40 years in particular. We one of the first EJ organization in the Midwest. We have many victories as far as environmental cleanup in Chicago. I mean, particularly around my community, and we're working towards to have the opportunity to host a solar farm in our community by forcing the Chicago Housing Authority to do this type of development. So what do just transition to clean economy look like for us? My mother, her name is Hazel Johnson. She passed away in 2011, and she was known nationally and internationally as the mother of environmental justice. And one of the things that she used to always say, one thing about, in particular in America, we know how to dirty up this country, but we don't have a workforce to clean it up. So her vision always has been to create an environmental remediation workforce where it can be inclusive of using renewable energy for our community area, because we have to change the way I practice and what we do. We was really spearheading in forcing the Chicago Housing Authority, which finance recycling in our community for over 20-something years. And in public housing, we was high recyclers in our community based on some of the other communities that was doing recycling, buyback recycling materials. So as we progress and understand that we have to find alternative solutions to the current operations that we do today, and what would that workforce really, really look like, is where we've been having many conversations and discussion around. And in the auspice of what my mother vision was to create this environmental remediation workforce. And this is one of the processes that can be accomplished, and it is so greatly needed. Just transitioning from working in industry that produce pollution or working in places that store it. We have to find another alternative to that, or use it to power up our energy. So looking at achieving 100, using 100% renewable energy has always been almost basically a foundation of our organization. We may not have called it that, but we always knew that in America, we such a dirty community as far as air, water, and land. Where's that workforce to be able to clean it up?
That's perfect. You were setting us up for a real good conversation already, Cheryl. Thank you for that. I'm going to turn it over to Kassie to give us her take also on how you know, like really when it comes to long-term jobs and the work that Jobs to Move America is involved with, how is this all integrated?
Thanks, Kyra. And obviously it's a long story to tell in 5 minutes, so I'll try to cover what I can, but I'm also happy to clarify or answer any questions. So just a little background about Jobs to Move America. We're a national policy center working on the frame of purchasing for the common good. The government at all levels spend about $2 trillion each year on goods and services. That is a lot of money. And most of that money has no strings attached as to how it's going to benefit communities or workers or promote equity or anything really. It's kind of, a lot of it's going to the lowest bidder, right? On a good day, if we're talking about what's happening in Chicago, as we all know. So Jobs to Move America believes we need to invest our public money, our public dollars into building healthy environments and having direct benefits to communities and workers. And we can do this in a few different ways. It includes building really robust coalitions of community-based organizations, labor unions, environmental groups, and workforce development groups who can come together and work together in new ways on policies that will help get the most out of our public money. And the signature policy that we work on, what we've really done some deep work on, is called the U.S. Employment Plan. And how that works is, so typically, and I'm going to use transportation as an example because we talk about transportation a lot and work very closely with a lot of transit agencies. Typically, when CTA or another agency is going to buy a bunch of electric buses, let's say, they're going to request that bidders say, the manufacturer who wants to build the bus, how cheap can you do it? How long is it going to take you? And there's sometimes a little about managerial approach, which is a little weird. And what kind of tech are they going to use? That's all good stuff to know. That's all stuff that makes sure we're getting great vehicles. But one thing that it misses is, how many jobs are you going to create? Who's getting those jobs? How much do they pay? What are the benefits? What is the training related to it? What's your plan to partner with community-based organizations or unions or workforce development organizations to make sure folks have the skills to do those jobs? So that all of that job stuff, all of that, the end piece I mentioned there, that's what we work on to implement as part of standard procedure at transportation agencies and beyond, making sure if you are getting millions or billions in some case of public money, of our tax dollars, that these private sector contractors are being held to higher standards around their workforce commitments for our communities, their plans to recruit marginalized workers. We work in manufacturing, which has historically excluded a lot of Black folks, Latinx folks, women, veterans, formerly incarcerated folks. So really getting these private sector manufacturers, if they want our money, they need to make real commitments around this, and that those commitments become part of their binding contract. So it's not just talk, it is part of their contract. If they don't do it, there are penalties. So we are working, we know that now, bringing this back to why have we been working with Sierra Club? Why have we been working with Ready for 100? Electric buses are happening. And we're at a real decision point where electric buses are going to either be really great American manufacturing jobs, or they're going to be the McDonald's of the future with really low standards, low unionization rates, not a lot of rights, not a lot of benefits, and largely happening in the right to work South, where worker standards are very low, which is the trend we're seeing. So my organization is working nationally on this. Los Angeles, New York, and Chicago buy a lot of buses. They buy a lot of trains. They have a big purchasing power and can affect the whole industry. So we're going deep with CTA and making sure that every time they buy something big, especially electric buses, now that we're in this like nascent industry that needs to grow and needs to be fed, that there is this good jobs piece, this equity piece, this this commitment from folks who are getting our money to build vehicles, that they're doing that in a way that's benefiting workers, benefiting communities, and getting deeper investment into training, and ultimately into good middle-class manufacturing jobs. And I'll stop, but one big number to keep in mind, if CTA were to implement the US employment plan, they would create about 19,000 good jobs as it replaces its fleet. That's a huge number of good manufacturing jobs and related jobs that could really rebuild American manufacturing, especially this high value manufacturing that's happening domestically. So I'll pause there.
Awesome. Thanks, Kassie. So I really appreciate having both of you on the phone tonight, or whatever we're on Zoom tonight, because I think this jobs piece sometimes gets really fuzzy, and in part because this is a growing and a quickly growing industry, that we know that this is everything from solar panel installers to management, right? And like companies that can be formed from this, as well as thinking about procurement efforts as well. Like, how do we really bolster an economy, not just for our city, the state, but even nationally? Like, we can be a big player here. And Chicago likes to do big things, right? So part of this commitment, and part of our team's commitment, is to ensure that we don't just get to say, yay, 100%, we did it. It's not done until it's done. And we are saying how we get there is really important. So thank you guys for helping us really fill out this jobs piece and what's possible. So Cheryl, you gave us a bit already about what a just transition to clean energy means to you, to PCR, and to Altgeld Gardens. How have you all already been a part of that, developing that conversation? Can you tell us a little bit more about the solar farm or some of the training programs you've been involved with?
Well, actually, just like I said earlier, a clean economy is very important to us, and particularly around energy uses. We tend to find that our community, particularly low income community, usually bear the highest burden when it comes to utility, right? But we don't have the leverage to have those jobs that is associated with the energy that we purchase for our home. For an example, have an opportunity to work for ComEd or People Gas, because your neighborhood can be easily redlined. But I'll leave it at that. I just had to make that point. But some of the training, we have always done training. PCR is in partnership with unions like the Coalition of Black Trade Unionists and the International Chemical Workers for Health and Safety. So we always did environmental training, just as I spoke earlier, is trying to create that remediation workforce. So we did it on hair swapper, underground storage tank, asbestos, and lead. And now we do mold remediation and OSHA 10. So training is very critical to, for one, is providing a new skill set and bringing in that transitional labor force who may have lost a job or who may want to change to a better job, to have those skill sets to go into that industry. But what has been challenging is that we have to really look at it for what its face value was. For an example, we did a project with the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers. I get all these names mixed up. And we was able to do recruitment for their solar training program. And we met with a lot of challenges, huge challenges, racial challenges, discrimination challenges among a lot of our trainees. So, and they didn't get the opportunity to get into any of the to get a job once they completed the program.
Mm.
And that's what you tend to see, that in the urban settings, like in Chicago, you may had a lot of community people of color participants, but the employment side was very low.
Yeah.
So, and when you look at the training,
Mm-hmm.
and when you look at the training, training have uplift people and gave them a new set of skills, but it also gave them the ability to be able to be part of these conversations that we are having tonight. So, how do I measure this? The success of this, that is to be determined. This is something new, and we have to work at making it better, and because this is a new industry that's coming to this country, I just think that the procurement of more jobs will create a lot of employment for folks. Like when you looking at the city of Chicago just came out with an announcement saying that they want all their buildings to be retrofitted. So, and that's an opportunity around energy use for energy efficiency. So that's a train opportunity for people to get engaged with. But I just hope that people have to remove the barriers that many urban folks experience walking through these training. And one of the things I'm gonna close with is that you'd be surprised how many people have been trained and have certifications right now today is not even working in the industry that they got this training. So we can't just set our people up to go through that same process again, and the outcome is still the same. We have to fight to make sure that it's equitable and fair for everyone.
You raise a really great point. There's training, there's certification, but if we're not actually putting people in these jobs, that's a huge loss, right? You're like wasting time, you're wasting
Right.
resources. Yeah, and there's plenty of work to be done. Kassie, did you want to tell us what a just transition looks like to you and for your work?
Yeah, and I can't emphasize what Cheryl said enough. There are people and organizations, sometimes for-profit organizations, that will just train people and churn people out. But if there is not a job placement and retention at the end of placement, it doesn't actually meaningfully impact people's lives. It doesn't get them into a good paying job and provide stability for them and their families. So that is so important, and very important to be tracking as well. Who's being trained, who's getting hired, and who's being retained through these jobs is super important. I think other aspects to keep in mind, and I suspect a lot of folks on this call are already there with us, making sure that as we are thinking about transition, a green transition, that we are prioritizing communities that have already been impacted by climate change, that are facing really air pollution and environmental pollution, often as a result of environmental racism. It's important that that's being addressed immediately and prioritized for investment and these new emerging technologies. I think relatedly, it's important that as these transitions are being played out in communities, that communities are in the driver's seat of what that transition needs to look like, that communities are able to dictate terms about what makes sense for them, what makes sense for folks who do need jobs in those places, and then also what they want the outcomes to be, what they want the goals to be. It needs to be community driven. Otherwise, top-down planning just creates more problems in the long term, even if it's well-intentioned. If communities are not integrally involved in the planning and implementation, it's not going to get us where we want to be. And I think also thinking about just transition for workers who are already in jobs. So thinking about CTA workers who would be impacted by transition to environment or to electric vehicles. We need to make sure that there's retraining for drivers. Electric vehicles handle a little differently than diesel vehicles. So we want to make sure that the folks who have put in their years of service are able to drive both electric buses and diesel buses. We also want to make sure we're keeping in mind CTA's maintenance folks is all done in-house. They don't outsource a lot of the maintenance. So there is going to be a need to make sure that folks know how to work on diesel buses and electric buses at the same time, that they know how to do it safely. Fortunately, with CTA, we've got a little bit of a leg up because the work does happen in-house, and also because a lot of the CTA system is already electric. There's some awareness of electric safety, but that is vitally important to make sure that folks have opportunity to, as their jobs transition and mutate and change, that they're allowed to reskill to have some self-determination and what they want to see for their futures as well.
So maybe this will be the last question that I'll ask you all, but then we invite you to ask any questions you have in the chat as well. That's to all of our participants, and I see one or two already. So if you have questions, drop them there. The last thing I'll ask you both is, do you think, particularly in this, the context around COVID-19 and the economic recovery that we need to see as a city and as a country, do you think that the clean energy transition has a role to play in getting people back to work, or needs to be a part of that transition and that recovery?
I can jump in. I think that it's doing this investment at this time is a win-win-win-win-win. Making sure that we are tackling the multitude of crises at once through coordinated programs makes a lot of sense to me. So making sure we're making investments in green technology, we're prioritizing training, hiring, and retention of people of color and women and formerly incarcerated folks and veterans who face really high barriers to employment often, especially in these more technical spheres. And then, making sure that we're addressing the fact that we have record unemployment, that we haven't been in a situation like this since the Great Depression, that we need a new deal, a Green New Deal, if you will, that's tackling a lot of these really pressing social economic issues at the same time.
Cheryl, did you want to chime in there? You're on mute still.
I concur with her. It's important that we, the most critical thing is getting the education to the communities that's been negatively impacted by, let's say just pollution alone, right? And having the conversation is to say that we're looking at these alternative opportunities and the job creation about it, but we have to be real about it, because it takes a whole lot, because I don't use the word energy efficiency in my community. I use utility savings for an example. So language has a whole lot to do with as far as communication, because we could start at the basic, but bring it up to where, they have a level of understanding what is energy efficiency, for an example. So just talking about a green economy, yes, that's the ultimate goal that I would love to see, and because it will have a tremendous positive impact on my community. But on the same token, how do the challenge will be, how do I really engage my community in this conversation when so many other essential needs that needs to be addressed? Because people is unemployed right now today. So they looking at how they're going to feed their kids. Kids is not in school today. So how I'm going to get that child care. So as we tried to have a conversation about, just for example, the potential of bringing a solar farm to my community, that conversation has to be intercepted with something else that's going on critical in our community. Even uh, putting it with the COVID-19, the pandemic we are experiencing here, connecting those, just the dots is there that we need to, and it's not just, as she said, it's not a one-all solution. It's the ability to bring all these different elements together to be able to affect change. But I just think that the basic conversation needs to happen at the ground level to get people motivated and encouraged to be engaged, so that we can move some policies in this city, this state, or this country.
All right, you heard it here. We should do this. I appreciate both of you for sharing that, and from like different vantage points too. Cheryl, I think you continue to bring up this piece about like an accessible conversation. How do we have this, if we say we want community to participate, how do we make room and do it in a way that allows community to participate? And we would also want to make sure that we're meeting people where they are in terms of what other needs and strains are on people right now. And I think given this year and everything that this year has been, COVID, the uprisings, the protests, the riots that we've seen, there's so much vying for everybody's attention, and not just for attention, like we need action, And so how can we have a coordinated conversation so that we're to Cassie's point, that the public money is being used in ways that is really helping those of us in most need, right? The communities that are experiencing and have been experiencing the greatest hardship as well. Awesome. Okay.
And I think it's a great opportunity right now because of all these different stresses. Talking about a green, clean economy is something positive, and it takes people to make this happen. So it brings us together, but we just got to bring it to the attention that would captivate folks to say, yeah, I think I got to spend some time with this, because this stuff is getting on my nerves. It's just too much negativity. This is something positive that's happening. So,
yeah. Well, we've got a few more minutes for some questions from our chat box. I think I've seen a couple so far. Again, if you want to ask any other questions, feel free to drop it in the chat. And Andrew also just shared our sign-in survey as well. So if you can, we really would appreciate if you signed that before our evening's over. So let me go ahead and get one of these questions. Luke asks, is there any statute in the Clean Energy Jobs Act that guarantees jobs for people of color or low to moderate income workers or communities? I don't know if anybody knows all of the Clean Energy Jobs Act necessarily, so no pressure there. But yeah, I guess broadly, if I may, Luke, how do we really, does CEJA funnel jobs in this way, or are there other ways that we can ensure that people of color or other marginalized communities can be a part of this economy?
Well, I don't know a whole lot about the Seizure Bill, because just like you said, it's complex. But what I seen was some of the discrepancy in the FEJA, that it didn't have any accountability for the performance, work performance, or the workforce performance, or the training or the number of contractors who receive contract actually hire the trainee. That's there's no accountability attached to that, whereas that they will be penalized if they don't meet a certain matrix that was established through the seizure. And that's how we have to address, I mean, through the seizure, but that's how we have to address that in the seizure. But we have to also remember that this is Illinois, and the politics that associate with a lot of things that, you know, if Illinois would just do things based on what's on the books and be accountable for it, we won't be seeing a lot of stuff, political
You mean money
misbehavior
wouldn't
as we
disappear?
see in this state, you know. So we have to be important and not to allow this to be politicized, but be a quality of life issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would. I am not a CJA expert, so I can't comment too deeply. I will say there's a couple of things that come up for me when I think about that question. Obviously, that's the thrust of JMA's work at large, is to make sure that this manufacturing sector is really supporting jobs for folks who have been systematically locked out from good manufacturing jobs, the kind of jobs that let you buy a house and send your kids to college and that kind of stuff. We run into legal barriers when we're working with federal money. So I think there's some interesting opportunities. The federal money doesn't allow race-based incentivizing of jobs and things like that. It has to be neutral, and we end up using proxies, things like low income, things like folks who are involved in the criminal justice system or foster care system. You know, it ends up being kind of ways to work around the fact that we can't just say, despite the fact that all policies basically forever have benefited white people, we can't say these policies now need to benefit people of color. That gets tricky, but I think there's opportunities in CJA because there is some state money to more specifically support hiring and retention of workers of color. So that's one piece. And the other thing I'll add, and this is work that we've done at JMA as well, is making sure that we are directly working with manufacturers or company owners to make sure that they are hiring people of color and women and other folks who've been excluded from jobs. So we, on the back end of winning big contracts with transportation agencies, we've been able to negotiate community benefits agreements with transit-related manufacturers. We have one with a company here in Chicago called CRRC down on the southeast side, where they're building 846 rail cars for a CTA. And we have a community benefits agreement with them that explicitly says that people of color and women are going to be first in line for pre-apprenticeship and for hiring after a pre-apprenticeship. So I think we need to be creative about not only how can we incentivize this through public sector policy and things like that, but also directly engaging with companies and with unions to make sure we are getting them to do what we need them to do, which is invest in people who've been systematically disinvested in.
Thank you both.
And I see one of the comments that someone said, what can you take away from this conversation today? And one of the things that this piece of legislation has to be driven by the people. You know, so what you can take away with this is to get engaged with this legislation. And if you see where your input can be part of it, get engaged with it. And we also have to promote this. You know, we have to promote this type of opportunity to come to Illinois, because Illinois, I've been doing environmental work for almost 40 years. And I could tell you about a lot of the resistance that I have been through just to see environmental justice get on the table and be a conversation as we speak it today. So I'm saying is nothing instantaneous to happen right now, but it's a process that we got to be involved, and we got to be and make the elected official accountable as you go vote for him to his constituents. You know what so it's I love your question of what's the call to action for today. Call to action is right now is to make sure that this piece of legislation get passed and to make sure that the workforce training happens in the different areas throughout the state. If you have some expertise or get engaged with it because you never know if you can be somebody's of importance with us and helping citizens get trained. There's a whole lot of need around retrofitting old houses in Chicago. You know, I mean, we got a lot of old houses that still may have lead in the asbestos. And now we seeing all these torrential rains, they may have some moisture issues. So how do you look at a neighborhood that's close to you and see how you can be engaged to change the mindset of the people over there and help them become a voice for promoting renewable energy, promoting a new workforce development in our area, because the unions already suck up all the trades. They're going to suck up this trade in the renewable energy aspect, but we have an opportunity to set some parameters as to how union do this with the input of community engagement. That's my perspective.
That's spot on. Thanks for addressing that, Cheryl. And I think you're also raising a point that David O'Donnell also put in the chat as well around union representation and how we ensure that there are opportunities for entrepreneurs and communities of color and various economic spaces, you know, given the history with unions as well. And like, that's a very, there's a lot of charged history. And even to the point that you led with, there are still things that are being worked through, you know? So, David, I don't think we're gonna have time today to dig into that one, but I wonder if we can raise it on another call within the series, which I hope you guys come to more of our talks. But this is great. And I think that last question is a good segue to kind of just get us set up for the next part of the next hour together. We really hope that you all will stick with us, because not only do we want to share information about the clean energy economy and what's going on, but how do we really in Chicago now say, look, this is what we want to see. Understanding the work and the history and where we are now, right? How do we address those historic injustices? How do we recognize and come to terms with where we are right now and design the path forward and say, hey, we have some places to course correct. We also have some opportunities we really need to take advantage of and chart a course for Chicago that is mindful of all of these things that Kassie and Cheryl have both raised. So we are going to take a brief break. We encourage you to stretch, go grab something to eat, go check on the people in the house, don't walk your dog. Come back sooner than it would take to walk your dog. But we hope that for the second part of the conversation, we're turning this over to you, all of our participants. So we're going to spend some time in breakout groups, and we are going to really hear from you. You'll have some time to debrief and really maybe jot down some other questions that you had, maybe for Cheryl or for Kassie, but maybe just the questions that you have on your mind. And then we'll have some time to reflect, and then we'll get down to actually identifying the priorities that we think should be a part of this transition plan. So
hey Kyra, can I say one thing before we break out?
For
just
sure.
A minute. You know, just imagine my experience working with elected officials 30-some years ago and then telling me, well, these industry got to go somewhere. Why not your neighborhood? Garbage got to go somewhere. Why not your neighborhood? And today, now we have a discussion about them looking at opportunities to make our state 100% renewable. So just think about 30 years ago, I was told that it got to go to somebody's neighborhood. Why not yours? Because of my income and being public housing. And look where we are
still
today.
happening. Yeah, look where we are today, and that's still happening. Maybe you guys, some of you know about what's going on with General Iron or some of the zoning concerns.
Well, you know what? But I'm just saying from the coldness of it, from hearing your elected officials say, why not your neighborhood?
Mm-hmm.
Today, that process is not the same. That type of thinking is really not the same, even though the practice may be. But I'm just coming from that, just remembering that 30 years ago, and to see that we having a conversation about it today in a positive industry. Yes, they still want to come to this area. There's going to always be that fight. But I'm just saying how the mindset has changed.
Perfect. Okay.